Okay, philosophers, welcome to Online Intro to Philosophy at Alfred University. So before we were so rudely interrupted by spring break and the coronavirus, we were in the middle of Descartes' meditations. So let's recap. Descartes wants to know how to provide a solid foundation for science, and in fact for the whole of human knowledge. So he asks if there is anything he can know for certain. In Meditation 1, he doubts everything he's ever believed, even imagining that an evil demon is deceiving him about everything. But at the beginning of Meditation 2, he concludes that even to be deceived, he must exist. So his first certainty is that he exists. He then asks, what am I? And he concludes that he's not essentially his body, since he can imagine himself having no body, but he can't imagine himself without his mind, his consciousness. So he concludes that he's essentially a thinking thing. In Meditation 3, he begins by asking if he's alone in the world or if he can discover that there are other beings apart from himself. He notices that he has in his mind an idea of God that is of an infinite perfect being, and he argues in a rather complicated way that this idea could not originate within himself. He, Descartes, a finite and imperfect being, could never produce such an idea. So God must exist, and the idea of God in Descartes' mind is an innate idea, one that God implanted in him. In the rest of Meditation 3, Descartes does two things. First, he anticipates and answers several objections to his argument, and we discuss some of those in class. Second, he offers another slightly different proof of God's existence. Very simply put, his argument goes like this. Descartes did not bring himself into being, nor is he aware of having the power to preserve himself from moment to moment. Yet something must be sustaining him in existence from moment to moment, and since it isn't him, it must be God. I'll let you judge that argument for yourselves. Let's move on to Meditation 5. Here, Descartes offers a third proof of God's existence. It's not entirely original with him. A famous medieval philosopher called Anselm came up with a similar argument in the 11th century, but Descartes gives it his own twist. The argument is usually referred to as the ontological argument. Don't be scared by the word ontological. It just means having to do with being or with existence. Descartes' argument can be summarized as follows. God, by definition, is a being with all the perfections. Necessary existence is a perfection, therefore God necessarily exists. It's a very famous philosophical argument, and some people still buy into it today, so let's examine it. The argument seems formally valid, that is, the conclusion follows from the premises. That doesn't mean it's sound. For an argument to be sound, the premises must be true. But if there is a problem, perhaps it is with one of the premises. Well, the first premise seems pretty reasonable on the face of it. Just as a triangle by definition has three sides, so God by definition is a supremely perfect being, which means he has all the perfections. So if there's a problem with the proof, it probably lies with the second premise. Yet this premise seems plausible on the face of it. Consider which is preferable. $100 that exists only as an idea in someone's mind, or $100 that actually exists in reality. The idea of the Mona Lisa, or the actual existing Mona Lisa. Suppose you try to think of God, but think of him as not existing. Then you're thinking of a supremely perfect being that lacks existence. But in that case, Descartes would say, you're not really thinking of a supremely perfect being at all. You're thinking of an almost perfect being, because a supremely perfect being would exist, and would exist necessarily, that is, always and self-sufficiently. It's like being asked to think of an equilateral triangle, and thinking of a triangle that has just two equal sides, not three equal sides. You haven't done what you're asked to do. And an equilateral triangle with just two equal sides is an impossibility. The very idea is self-contradictory. Well, according to Descartes, exactly the same is true of the idea of a supremely perfect being that does not exist necessarily. That's a contradiction. Needless to say, people have raised objections. Here's one, very famous objection. If the argument works to prove that God exists, then you could just as easily prove that the perfect island exists. What is the perfect island? It's the island that has all the perfections you would want in an island, all the insular perfections. Perfect climate, sandy beaches, free amenities, 24-hour happy hour, better free margaritas, free amenities, nude beaches, etc. Now ask yourself which you'd prefer to book your holiday on. The perfect island with the free margaritas and the nude beaches, or the one that's just an idea in your mind. Obviously, you'd prefer the one that actually exists. That indicates that the one that exists is more perfect. Well, now we can construct a parody of the ontological argument as follows. The perfect island, by definition, has all the insular perfections. Existence is an insular perfection, therefore the perfect island exists. Well, if the ontological argument is sound, then so is this argument. But this argument can't be sound, since the conclusion is obviously false. Sadly, the perfect island doesn't exist. Therefore, the ontological argument must have something wrong with it. Well, where does the problem lie? As we said before, it seems to be in the second premise, but it's hard to say what it is. One option is to deny that existence is a perfection. When we justified that claim earlier, we used one-sided examples, like which is better, $100 that exists or $100 that's only an idea in your mind? But we could use other examples to cast doubt on the idea that existence is a perfection. Which is preferable, the idea of a child in extreme pain or an actual existing child in extreme pain? The idea of a serial killer in Stephen King's mind or an actual, real, in the flesh serial killer? There's another, more subtle objection, and that is to deny that existence is really a property of things at all. Here's how this objection works. According to Descartes, existence is a perfection. But existence is not a property of things like their colour or their shape or their size. Describe a tree that you're imagining. It's tall, it has green leaves, it bears fruit, it rustles in the wind, etc. Now describe the same tree, which is not just an idea that you're imagining, but the same tree in reality. Well, it's tall, it has green leaves, it bears red fruit, it rustles in the wind, etc. Oh, and one other thing, it exists. But really, the two descriptions are identical. When you say, oh, and the second one exists, you haven't actually added anything to the description, right? The description of that second tree, the existing tree, doesn't contain anything new, right? Conclusion, existence isn't a property of things, rather it's a precondition for things having any properties at all. That's a powerful argument developed by the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant.